One, two, three.
Welcome to Scéalta. My guest, who you may well recognise, is Ciarán Mac Giolla Bhéin. So Ciarán, welcome to Scéalta. And I want to just maybe tease out a number of things that you're involved in. And I don't want to just concentrate on any one, but I would say to begin with, of my generation, people who were involved in the defence of the language and people who fought for the language and conjure up ideas of older men and women probably sitting somewhere in a room that they've got a land off, communicating through Irish and fighting their corner. And thank God they did, because without them, without the art skulls of this world, we wouldn't have the language and its vibrance that we have today. You represent an entirely different generation, of course. You're the first generation of Irish language activists who were taught completely through the medium of the Irish language, both the primary and secondary and through your life. So tell me a wee bit about that.
Okay, Joe, well, there's just Ciarán Mac. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to be here chatting with you. And I think just your point that you made is completely spot on the money. I mean, previously, and I think the reason for this is very straightforward, really. Previously, people living in this part of Ireland were denied any right or any access to the Irish language. So anyone who did find the extra time to go and acquire the language or learn it, and then to begin organising around it, had to do so in addition to their lives. So it wasn't something that was made available through schools. It wasn't something that was promoted in any way by the state. In fact, in many cases, the opposite was true. So that explains why previously it was more of an older generation that would have been involved in organising, protecting and promoting the language through classes and stuff. But one of the most important things that generation done, which completely transformed everything, was that they took a decision 50 years ago last year to set up a school. And when they set up the school, that transformed everything, and that changed everything entirely. What it did was it then got a new generation of young people through who were educated through Irish and who, whether consciously or subconsciously, witnessed the sacrifices that other people were making on their behalf to promote this abstract thing of a language with them. And as they get older, I believe that it definitely had an impact, personally speaking, on myself, but also on many people of my generation who were educated in that environment, whereby we saw our parents going into schools to paint over the weekends, to tidy the place up, going around bars collecting money to pay for teachers' wages and stuff. Simple things like that, but really, really strong and powerful and profound acts by parents and by the larger community of teachers and support network that was built around that. So that had a massive impact on myself and on many others of that generation. It continues to have a massive impact. And when these young people leave school, it isn't just where you leave and you go and get a job and you sail off into the sunset and live the rest of your lives. There is, and amongst many of us, this desire to give something back, having witnessed the sacrifices of others that helped us get this education, get this amazing education through Irish. Very fortunate to go through this process. There is then a desire and a willingness to say, okay, well, what can we do now that I've been through that, now that I have a job, now that we're working here, now that we live here and much older, how can we ensure that the next generation is afforded not only the same opportunities, but even more opportunities than those that we were afforded. So that was definitely in my formative years, although again, I wasn't really conscious of it at the time. I was young and going to school and messing about like everybody else. But that was definitely, that had a massive impact on me. And it's only kind of when you get older, when you're reflecting on your early years and your childhood, where you understand just how powerful an impact it had. I had two older brothers who went to La Salle and went to English medium schools. The option of Irish medium education just wasn't available for them at the time. And, you know, I could see the difference. And I mean, this is something that we've discussed ourselves at length over many times, but I could see the difference in terms of not only the method of education, but the whole ethos behind it, in terms of comparing what was happening within their schools. And again, really dedicated, brilliant teachers and stuff, but there was definitely something unique and different taking place within the walls of our school. Even in terms of, I was the first in my house to be taught Irish history, for example. So even schools in West Belfast in a very politically active climate, we're still being taught about the kings and queens of England and about the royal families and everything like that. We were taught first and foremost about our own history, and that gives us a very much grounding and an understanding of how we've arrived at this process, how this historical process has taken place, which now means that the vast majority of people outside of our school speaks English. How do we arrive at that? This isn't something that happened by accident. It actually happened by design. And when you start to unpack that, then you can say, well, what can we do to maybe try and take those steps back again? And that's kind of, again, on a subconscious level, that's the massive impact that maybe school in my formative years had on me, and has meant that generation after generation of young Irish speakers have emerged from the school. Not all, of course, but a good percentage of them with this burning desire to say, like, okay, well, what can we do now? What can we do to give something back?
I remember, just to lead on from that answer, I remember talking to Ciarán Mac Giolla one time, and just out of curiosity, how Shaw's Road survived. Just how did it not even progress? How did it survive on a week-to-week or a day-to-day basis? And in his own intrepid way, he laughed and he said, this wasn't about education. This was a way of life. This was everything. This was children and parents and grandparents and all of that being part of an act of defiance, but more importantly, part of an act of building. When you were, what school did you go to initially?
Bunskull Football First Year on the Shaw's Road. So at that time, that was the only school, and then on to Manskull, which was located in the building that I'm in now, the Cultúrlann.
Well, you were, and you say, and obviously you were quite a young child, but was there an atmosphere that you were pioneers, that this was just not, obviously when you weren't at school, you were playing with children who were learning through the medium of English, but were you aware that there was something unique, set aside, different from other schools?
Yes and no. I suppose in my younger days, it was school. It was like anything else. I suppose what's different, when I'm raising my kids through Irish, my kids also attend an Irish medium school. And for instance, when I'm calling them in for their dinner and I shout out to them in Irish, half the street answer me because they're all attending Irish schools and they all speak Irish. When I was a kid, I was the only one. I was the only one around for the next load of streets who was at Irish school. So it was a completely different experience that I had, whereby today it's much more common. And as I say, there's many more children, brilliant stuff, that are actually attending Irish medium. So there was more this idea of we're kind of different, because it was different. It was the only school, and people had to get buses from Ardoyne and from the Upper Springfield, from Short Strand and stuff. So there'd be buses carrying 20, 15, 30 kids from different parts of the city, all to attend this school, which again was kind of different for a primary school, and you understood that was slightly different as well. We were taught in porta cabins. We didn't have the big buildings. But I think as I moved more into secondary school, then that became much more visible to me in terms of the difference, because I remember at that time when we were in school, the school was denied funding, the school was denied recognition. During those early years when I was attending, it was still a very small school. I used to joke that the entire school could go on a school trip, and I was in first year, there was second year and third year, and all 3 years could go on a school trip on the one bus. It was that small. So we used to be able to travel down to Galway and stuff, and that first year was kind of brilliant and really built a bond between the kids that had attended the school at that year. But as well as being kind of educated through the medium of Irish, we're also being educated in political activism and in participation, because there was a campaign, and the teachers and the school and our parents didn't try and insulate us from that. We were front and centre of that campaign. So we were there when there was a protest outside the Department of Education. We were there with our batty score, with our tally sticks, tying them to the railings in Rathgale House out in Bangor and stuff, which was in the early 90s and middle of Bangor. A bit mad when you think about it in this current climate, but that was the ethos of the school. They very much and kept the kids informed of the entire process. We've been denied funding. Here's why we've been denied funding, and here's what we're going to try and do about it, and here's how you can help. So that built into us a spirit of the can do. The old Shaw's Road, you mentioned Ciarán Mac Giolla there. The old Shaw's Road ethos of na habarai jane, don't just talk about it, do it. So, and that's very much, that is a theme that's run concurrently through the Irish language community since. that this idea, and I know that we'll probably get into it later on in the talk here around the whole campaign for an Irish Language Act, but alongside any campaign, alongside asking the British government to fund Irish medium schools, people were just going out and setting them up. They weren't waiting for the green light. They weren't waiting for permission. They weren't waiting for all the conditions to be right. They didn't wait until they could pay every teacher's wages and stuff. They set it up, and then they worried about all those things, and all those things will come, and we'll go and make this happen. And I think, particularly in our own society, that there's strong lessons for us to learn in terms of all that. That certainly advocacy, campaigning and stuff is incredibly important, but it's enhanced immeasurably when it's complemented by an actual developmental strategy as well, which isn't just dependent on the state giving something. We're going to do this ourselves. When you embarrass the state into doing something by ordinary citizens taking agency into their own hands and doing it, that almost trumps any advocacy or campaigning tool that you can have. So that's something that was that people like Ciarán Mac Giolla Bhéin, Seamus, many others from Shaw's Gaeltacht, they absolutely pioneered that idea. They went out and built the Gaeltacht and set up a school under threat of arrest in 1971, which really, when you think about it, has changed history and has changed the entire dynamic. I mean, for the past 3 years, outside of maybe Brexit, the biggest issue has been the talk of the Irish language and the status of Irish language within society here. None of that would have been possible were it not for that very small cohort of families who decided to set up a school in defence of the state at the time. And you fast forward 50 years and here's where we are. So that's a lesson to us all, and that's something that when I'm maybe speaking to younger people and stuff, we're constantly sold this idea that, you know, change comes when, you know, some great supreme leader, usually a man, usually a white, rides in on a horse with all the answers and can solve all the issues. That's not what happens. It usually comes when a couple of ordinary people get together with a vision and a bit of determination and start planning and organising. And that's a great example Shaw's Road is of that. Ordinary people, weren't rich, didn't have access to a lot of resources, but had an idea and had a lot of determination and saw it through right to the end.
You talked about that bond that the children learning through the medium of Irish form with each other. And I know in your case, those friendships have lasted 20 years plus. But there also was a bond that was formed between the teachers and the children. And one of my granddaughters attended College de Fiesta. And so I had to go periodically just to get an assessment from teachers and all of that. And the informality but respect that teachers had for pupils and pupils had for teachers, I think was, as you say, a lesson for us all. And also, in fact, the fact that there was no religious knowledge taught within schools was massive. I mean, that in itself in West Belfast was something that was either heritage from the Catholic Church or innovated from everybody else. Yeah. So, I mean, there are many lessons that we need to learn from those early days, those pioneer days, and all of that. I'm going to jump you just slightly forward a wee bit, and I want to. And you mentioned it, and I want to pick up on that point. And for all the obvious reasons and for the difficulties, and I'm thinking, for instance, of the art school, where people battled on, held ranks, learned lessons, taught lessons, and the water dripped through the roof. And depending on where you were sitting, you were in charge of the bucket to collect the rain. A lot of older people, a lot of men and women who had, for instance, been in prison for a variety of activities, but they were so dogged, they just kept going and kept going and kept going. And then we have in 2000 and slightly before that, we have a campaign, and I want to bring you to the campaign. A campaign that's been led by young people, by people who are trendy. In your own case, people who are young, who are good looking, who are 6 foot plus. I'm often mistaken for you, I meant to say to you. But people who are outside of the stereotypical culture vultures, and they're into all of that. And I mean, you mentioned the protests in Bangor and the protests in Stormont, and I went to a few of them. Young people, generations. It's often said that a generation will not accept the hardships or the conditions or the discrimination of the generation they've just replaced. Was that the case with the campaign for the acknowledgement of the language?
Yeah, undoubtedly so, and I think that's still the case today. I mean, things that I would be, if you like, maybe I could tolerate, if you like, or I've become accustomed to or used to. The younger generation are like, not a chance, that's not happening. So they're ones that are constantly raising the bar, and I think that's the way a healthy democracy should work, and that's when you have active citizens and stuff, people playing an active role in politics and in their own lives, as opposed to just, subcontracting those jobs out to supposed political leaders or community leaders or whatever, but ordinary people taking this. So that's something that's definitely the case in terms of myself and my own education and where it led me, and certainly the case very much right through till today. But I can remember, when I just completed my degree and stuff at Queen's, so I've been educated entirely through Rise in, materially speaking, substandard conditions. So we didn't have Fergus O'Hare was our principal, and he was also our science teacher. And again, one of the stories I tell, we had no equipment, so we didn't have Bunsen burners. We had a picture of a Bunsen burner, and then Fergus would pull out a lighter from his pocket and say, and this is what a Bunsen burner does, essentially. So that was the way our education worked. So we were okay, we were active, and we're saying, okay, we need to challenge this, but we're also aware that there's something deeply wrong with this. How come, just by virtue of the fact that we're educated through your own native language, that the state has deemed us to be, unacceptable and unworthy of the proper resources and everything else. So that really left an indelible mark on us. And then when you were going on to places like Queen's and you were sitting in the leafy suburbs of South Belfast, and you were seeing the contrast between the communities that we were coming from and the wealth and everything else that exists in this other part of the city. And there is almost kind of a crossroads where you come to in terms of particularly the language, whereby when you're completing your degree and stuff, and there's maybe one or two paths you can take, and one of them is to lead you along the routes of academia and using the Irish language and treating the Irish language as something that is almost sacred, and that only can be handled by those of really high and supreme knowledge, and it isn't for something for the common folk to use in places like Ballymurphy and stuff. That's one route you could take. The other route, the route that I and others took, was, okay, well, how can we use this revival? We've been given a gift of the Irish language. Many people, including our parents and including the community, who always were out giving money for the wee Irish school, as they called it, in the boxes when people are going around locking doors. How can we give something back to that community? And this is people that had nothing. How can we give something back? So when we took the decision then, and when we left university, myself and some friends and stuff, to establish some type of network in the Upper Springfield to help promote the Irish outside of the classrooms. We had a bunch called Cleva Give that had been established maybe 6-7 years earlier, and then Gael School in Móna, which was also very recently established. We had attended school, and our experience of going through school was the Irish language existed only within that school. Outside of that school, there was zero silts, and essentially you knew every other Irish speaker in the city because they were either your teacher or they were in school with you. And that was basically it. So as the language started to develop and more schools started to emerge, we said, well, listen, we need to do more to promote this in a social environment. So giving these kids more opportunities to learn the language, but also importantly, giving these communities the Irish language as a resource to improve their lives, to improve their communities and stuff. And that's, we had the idea then and established Glór and Móna during this period with the idea of just organising classes, using that same kind of na haber Johnny, don't talk about it, do it attitude. Going out, we'll find the money for it later, appoint a few teachers. But obviously we undertook that at a time when things were changing for the better. So as a result of the Good Friday Agreement and stuff, Forest na Gaeilge was established, there was some money available. We could then employ teachers, we could employ eventually a development officer to undertake that work and work within that organisation doing that work. But it was very much our focus from the outset that the people most worthy of the gift of the Irish language are the people of West Belfast, are the people of Lenadoon, the people of Ballymurphy, the people of Lower Falls. They're the people who are being custodians in one form or another of this culture, who've resisted against the eradication of this culture, even through passive acts of just giving 50p every weekend buying the tag cards and stuff. And it's within these communities that we want to use the language. That and again, you touched on something there, Joe. It isn't this romanticized, misty-eyed view of an ancient Ireland where people are sitting by the fire playing the harp and reciting, the verse of Raftery. It isn't about that. It's about the practical utility of a language in today's world. So we have the areas where Irish schools are located. By and large, if you look across the north, are the most depraved areas in the north. They're the ones that have suffered the most during the conflict and continue to suffer the most because of the peace dividend just hasn't reached those communities yet. So how can we use the language, and how can the language be used as a means of enhancing, of building these communities up, of offering people opportunities in the education again, of offering young people opportunities in the employment as youth workers and whatever else, and of creating a kind of common bond, and also this idea of kind of what people like Frantz Fanon talked about and others, this idea of decolonizing, of undoing the damage that was done to our communities over successive generations, including the eradication and the stealing of our culture and our language, of bringing that back, giving that back to the community and seeing what can happen with that as a means of reviving.
I remember very, very well, and I want to talk about the Dream Dearg Campaign and how it came about and where, and the seeds of that idea. But I remember in response to a report that had been produced about the viability of the language and economically how the language lifted other books and all of that. I remember a unionist politician talking, and it could have been anyone, but it was a unionist politician, talking about, this is not, we've nothing against the Irish, and this is not personal. And I remember your interview saying it's very much personal. It's very much personal. It's about my identity, my soul, who I am, what I want to be, and all of that. So how did the campaign, how did it mushroom? Was there a nucleus of let you make the point, don't talk, let's do? Was there that kind of, or was it spontaneous, or how did it get off the ground? How did it lift?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's a number of factors involved, Joe. So we as you remember, in 2014, we had organised a similar march and kind of campaign. It was much shorter focus, if you like. At that time, because of austerity that was introduced, there were a number of cuts that were being made to Irish language organisations, and also because of the resistance of political unionism to the Irish language, simple things like the Monskull in South Derry that people have been campaigning and working hard for just couldn't get off the ground. Just the state was incapable of providing for them. So a number of these small localised issues, and in addition to that, the overarching issue of the lack of legislation, which had been promised in 2006 at St Andrews, that still hadn't been delivered. So there was a march at that time that brought focus on that. That brought a lot of success, it should be said, because the Monskull and Derry then was given permission. They started, and now it's flying. They've hundreds of kids there. They started off at 14 and either in the third or fourth year, and they're really, really strong out in Dungiven there. The issue of College of First Year, the transport provision for there, again, had to be a campaign led by the pupils, led by the parents in North Belfast and places like Ardoyne and New Lodge, who then said, listen, we can't afford, why should finances being prohibited to us sending our kids to Irish school? Because for us to do that, we have to spend £30 a week in transport, and we don't have that. Talking about, again, some of the most depraved areas that we have here in our city, and because the only choice available to them in education through Irish was in College of First in the West, they were expected to put this bill themselves. When we know that there's a flurry of buses that are bringing kids to places like Ince to Methody from all over the north, and the complete inequality of it was glaring. So there was a campaign around that, which again was successful. But because of that, the whole issue of an Irish Language Act had kind of fallen off, if you like, the Richter scale. And moving into 2016, obviously, as you know, there were political changes at that point. A number of parties pulled out of the executive. There was fresh elections held in, I believe, May of 2016. And as a result of that, there was a kind of two-party executive between Sinn Féin and the DUP. And in around October of 2016, a draft programme for government was published, and there was a zero reference to any kind of overarching strategy or Irish Language Act or legislation and stuff. And that really did rail people, because the campaign at that point was at its lowest ebb. But even up until that point, there had always been nods, and even if there were only pretense, and even if there were only garnish and pretend, and really not really, but there was always something there to say, well, we'll try and do this, or we are reaffirming our commitment to do X, Y, and Z for the Irish language. At this point, there was really nothing. So we convened a meeting here in the Cultúrlann, and you know yourself, I'm sure, Joe, as through a lifetime of activism that you've had, that something when you call a meeting and suddenly 60 people show up, and there's just an energy and a buzz in the room. And we're going, okay, well, this is kind of different. The climate is kind of different here. So we used that period from October, November. We used that period to get our kind of own house in order, if you like, to look at, okay, well, what are we trying to achieve here? Who are we? What's a brand? And simple things like that. Simple, but really, really important things. So we knew that we had, if you like, the network of committed activists, the people who had been involved in 2014 and even gone as far back as 2007 and stuff in the campaigns then. We had that network of committed activists. We knew that we had what people like Gramsci talk about, the earthworks and fortifications. So the organised communities out in Dungiven, in North Belfast, here in West Belfast, in Mahara and Derry, in Armagh and stuff. We had these communities who were organised and ready to do. What we were waiting for, what we didn't have, was the kind of organic political crisis, and that was presented to us, gift wrapped by Paul Given in the 23rd of December when he announced that he was removing the LEFA fund, in the heart of the biggest political and financial scandal that this state's ever seen, the RHI scandal. So 500 million, what they estimated at that time, had literally went up in smoke. And here we have a minister removing 50,000 means tested grant from some of the most vulnerable people in our society, denying them the chance to go to the Guilt Act. Which again is something that resonates with people here, because people from many generations have been going to the Guilt Act, and suddenly this was arbitrarily removed in a very crass and crude way with an email on the 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, saying, sorry, due to efficiency savings, we can no longer fund this. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And that was literally the email that was received.
And this is the party that said it wasn't personal.
Yeah, that's exactly. So at that point, but then, again, this follows a long pattern. Because what we have seen, and again, I'm old enough now to have witnessed all the different kind of machinations of Stormont since Good Friday and in various forms that it's emerged. But what we have seen is a pattern, particularly in relation to the DUP, but not exclusively. With other unionist parties have done the same. When you have political pressure, a big political issue, the dog that is easy to kick is the Irish language. In terms of proving your credentials, and the DUP at this time were under enormous pressure, not only from other parties, not only from the media, but particularly even from within their own community, who were saying talking about corruption and stuff. So for them, the easy way out is we'll do what we've done previously. We'll draw attention. We'll prove our bona fides and our credentials again to our base by attacking the Irish language. Only this time, they just happened to do that at the very wrong time. What they weren't aware of was that there was this crazy group of activists that had been coming together for a couple of months and who were just ready to pounce. So we had then organised on I think it was the 12th of January 2017, a protest outside the Minister's office, Paul Given's office, down at the Causeway Exchange there, beside the City Hall. And that morning, so we had been up making the banners and stuff up in Glór in the morning, putting everything together and about to head down. And that morning he sent out a tweet saying, I found the money. He must have found it down the side of his limo seat or whatever. So the LEFA scheme's back on. But the cat was out of the bag. We said, listen, the LEFA scheme is nothing. Of course it's important. We're happy that that's back. But what we're about is we're about bringing about systematic change to ensure that bigoted ministers like yourself can't arbitrarily take decisions that have a massively adverse impact on Irish speakers just because they're Irish speakers. Those days need to be over. We're talking about 2006, we're talking about, a commitment made. And also, Joe, I think if you put this in the international context here as well, what we've seen during that period and even since then is you've seen rise in activism by young people. You've seen these autonomous movements of young people coming about who aren't waiting on, the previous institutions, the big political parties, or institutions that take the lead on issues, that are happy to take the lead themselves. And that's certainly something what happened with I was the oldest person by and large in the meetings, And it was all young people who were saying, you know, no way, we're going to, and people came from various backgrounds. Some people were politically affiliated, others weren't. But what we said from the very outset was, listen, see, whatever political identity or anything else you have here, you leave it at the door. We're in here for one singular focus, and that is about bringing about the change in relation to the Irish language that has been promised to us and that is yet so far.
That protest that you're referring to, I attended, as did you say, hundreds and maybe 1,000 people at it, and it was very animated. There were flares, there were banners, it was very colourful and all of that. But as well as that, I think for me, and this is just my observation, it was clear that the young people who were in the predominance at the protest, they were in advance of the political parties that were both in the assembly and some who were trying to get into the assembly. And again, the point that you're making is the case. You know, these are people who had an issue, justifiably, and they were doing something about it, and they weren't waiting on approval from anybody. Can I just maybe move you on slightly and talk in terms of, we've talked about the language, which of course is something you're passionate about, and we all should have a concern about. The meetings that led up to, the engagements that led up with the various ministers and the various departments, and the delaying tactics or the misunderstandings and all of that. And you attended most of them, and you acted as spokesperson after those meetings. And you're not renowned for your, let me just put this diplomatically, you're not renowned for your patience, okay? And you're quite a large individual, which is why I get mistaken for you. From an individual point of view, how nerve-wracking was that? How perhaps even frightening that you're there, that you're young, that you're enthusiastic, that you're in the right, but these things require a degree of diplomacy, and they require articulation when you because that's where the unionists and those who were opposed to the language lost. They lost because they had no legitimate argument why the language should be blocked. So from an individual, just a personal view, how difficult was that for you?
Well, yeah, you're 100% there in terms of, that was, I mean, in one respect, it was quite an easy case to make, if that makes sense, because genuinely, the more you scratch beneath the surface, and like this is something that was discussed at length on the radio stations, on TV stations. You say I kind of acted as spokesperson, so more often than not, I was the one in the radio stations or in the TV stations, doing the interviews and stuff, and talking back and forth with people who were offering counter arguments to it. But the more it became clear to me at a personal level, there is absolutely no reason. There is no legitimate argument against this. These people have no justification for continuing to deny rights to Irish speakers here in the north. So in that respect, it was almost an easy task in terms of just if you go on to argue against somebody else about something, you know, you knew that you had the weight of argument behind you. You had the right side of the argument. You were on the right side of history on this one. If you like, it was a new experience because suddenly, I mean, I'd been working for Conor Gilligan, and we were doing stuff around campaigning and stuff. And I mean, it was at times it would have been hard for us to get a meeting with City Council, you know, or even to get an interview with the Andy Town News, with all due respect to the Andy Town News.
Yeah, of course.
But suddenly to go from that to suddenly you're on Newsnight, BBC, you know, you're being interviewed by the Washington Post, the New York Times, you're in meeting with the very senior, with the head of political parties, you're meeting with the Taoiseach and you know, with the Secretary of State here or whatever else. So it was a massive leap in terms of all that. I think, to be perfectly honest about this and to try and be as kind of as frank as possible, that isn't something that made me personally hugely nervous. I was never nervous about, maybe it was because of the education and everything else was here, but never nervous. I never felt that these people somehow are up here on a pedestal and that you should be nervous going in to chat and meet them. Or discuss with them about anything. What I was always concerned with was, am I doing justice to the people? Because I knew that I was only one part of a massive organism of people who were putting in serious hours, and I mean serious hours, who were up working non-stop. It just so happened that my job was by and large, the mouth, the person who vocalised this stuff, who went into meetings and whatever. But behind that, there was a huge amount of people who were campaigning. And I was always conscious and aware of and try to be mindful of the fact that I hope that I am articulating and I hope that I am doing them justice when I'm getting into these meetings or when I'm doing this radio interview. And I hope that they feel that I am adequately representing their hopes, their fears, their ambitions, and everything else around this campaign. So that's where, if there were any, if you like, nerves or any trepidation around anything, that's where it was rooted more in the hope. And again, as you move into the era of an agreement being made and stuff, that becomes even more pronounced, because you know that obviously, you know, we have many issues with the agreement that was arrived at the beginning of this year.
Yeah.
Seems like a lifetime ago now after COVID. And
everything. Of course, yeah.
We had numerous, so, but you're trying constantly to walk that tightrope, and you know that you're representing a broad church of people who you've brought with you over the last 3 or 4 years. School kids who've been out constantly on the streets, parents who've been bringing them to protests on Saturdays, volunteers who've been out making banners, and people who've been on social media hounding politicians for 3 years. And finally, you're at this point where there is deals being made, and you're trying to address this and represent it. And I remember at that time, you know, media phoning non-stop, constantly just waiting on a line from you, and you're going, we need to get this right, because so many people have dedicated so much for so long here that this needs to be watertight and this needs to be right. So that was always something more than, you know, whoever it was you were meeting. Because what you find, and you know, I tell this to anybody, what you find when you're getting, these people aren't special. You know, these senior politicians, these senior media people and stuff are just like ordinary people like me and you. You know, that they have their flaws, they have their faults. They aren't super duper intelligent. They aren't super duper able. They're just like anybody else. So when you go in with that mindset of, you know, it's just an ordinary punter, this is Joe Austin I'm talking to down at the Cultúrlann having a cup of coffee, then you become much more relaxed about it.
It's often said that a giraffe is a horse designed by a committee, right? And just the point that you're making, and because there's an intensity, a passion, an honesty, there is a need, a desire to get it right, because sometimes you're trying to cover all the points. I found that meeting before the meeting, when everybody's giving you direction, everybody's telling you what to say, everybody's telling you how to stand, where the interview should be, how you should approach the meeting, is actually more nerve-wracking than the event itself.
Yeah.
Of all those meetings, and we're going to move on because I want to talk about other cultural issues that I know you're involved in, but and can I just say, Fergus O'Hare, who you mentioned earlier on, hasn't been particularly well this last time. So can me and you just send our best wishes to him, and I hope that he gets better. Although I'm told his improvement is rapid. But sure, that's Fergus. What else?
Fergus.
Can I, in terms of that sort of one door opening to another door. So the language, of course, is a predominant issue that's affecting the Glór community everywhere, but in our city in particular. But the spin-offs, you know, that you've seen, and I'm thinking, for instance, now about Radio Falcha. I'm thinking now about the cartoons that were produced in the pamphlets, the booklets, all that stuff. Can you tell me perhaps a wee bit? I know you weren't directly involved in it. What about a wee bit about that? Did that add to the campaign? Did it add to the kind of the growth of the language and revival?
Yeah, like undoubtedly. I mean, I mentioned earlier in terms of the kind of core component parts when we were building the campaign and the network of activists, and then what's referred to as the kind of earthworks and fortifications, and that is what it was. It's impossible. You can't, you know, we couldn't campaign for an Irish Language Act if an Irish language community didn't exist. It just wouldn't make sense, and it wouldn't be possible. So when you're campaigning for something, you're campaigning for recognition and rights and respect and everything else, and it has to be backed up by an actual community who's behind that, who's saying, yes, that's us they're talking about, that's us that this debate about, that's me who's raising my kids through Irish, or that's me a second year up in college to first year. And I think, you know, in terms of, and that's something that was often missing from the debate. The debate was almost carried out at almost like an abstract political level, and people constantly talking about whether we should or we shouldn't, blah, blah, blah. And I was always missing that. And you know, I tried my best, maybe I didn't always succeed, but to pull that back down to, listen, we have a community of people here. Let's not forget about that. There are people, regardless of what we do, and regardless of what progress is made or isn't made on this issue, they're going to exist tomorrow again. And this issue isn't going to go away. So whether you're Arlene Foster or whether you're Julian Smith or Brokenshire before him or whoever it is, that they can deal with this now, or else you can put it off. But the issue is constantly, because not only is this community still here, but this community is expanding at an exponential rate. I mean, if you see the increase in numbers in Gaelscoill, if you see the added infrastructure that's coming on now, you mentioned Radio Falsa, you know, huge radio station now with a new building. We can see how the Irish language organisations communities are really taking root in communities right across the north, and places like South Derry and Maharada, where they have a 50-year language plan, where they have a huge chunk of that population in that area now using the Irish language as a daily life. They're not suddenly going to revert to English because Stormont or the British government has decided not to give them the Irish Language Act. They're going to continue living their lives through Irish, and they're going to continue to be more vocal about their rights and respect. So that was something that we were always trying to impress on them. But you mentioned something earlier, Joe, about people being ahead of political parties.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that, in terms of the lessons of our campaigns for broader society, and I mean, you know, I'm not an Irish language activist in isolation from everything else, so I'm aware, you know, one of the points that we had made during this campaign is that, you know, it's one thing having an Irish Language Act and you know, the right to Irish language services and everything else, but if kids in Ballymurphy are still having to go to food banks, then I'm not happy. You know, I'm not going to say, oh, well, you know, as long as the food bank service is available in Irish. No, we don't want that. You know, it's about economic, social rights as well. And I think one of the lessons from our campaign has been, whether consciously or unconsciously, but I think from Good Friday Agreement, that civil society took a back foot. And what I mean by that was that because peace became, and for complete and entirely justifiable reasons, and can entirely understand this, but achieving and sustaining and maintaining that peace trumped everything else. So any criticism of Stormont, any criticism of rates inequalities, of imbalances, of people's situations not improving as a result of the peace, was almost always pushed to the back bus, because the primary focus was maintaining the peace process and constantly nourishing the peace process. So all these other issues were ignored, and civil society was complicit in that, in my view, because civil society took a back foot and bought into that. And you can, you know, even the trade unions and other organisations, and I'm not focusing on them, right across the board, all bought into that. And I think that what our campaign, and indeed other campaigns, if you like, taught and provided people confidence to go out and say, listen, you know, that can no longer be used. And like, it isn't acceptable. Many of the kids that were out in our protests weren't even born with St Andrew's Agreement was saying. Certainly weren't born with Good Friday Agreement. So those arguments can't be used anymore. Certainly the peace process is important, it's embedded, but it can't be used as justification for continuing to deny people's rights. If rights upset people, then that's their problem. It's not my problem.
Well, Gerry Adams quite often, and rightly so, talks in terms that peace is not the absence of violence, it's the absence of the reasons for violence, and cultural identity suppressed is certainly one of the ingredients of unrest. So I mean, the two things are not mutually exclusive, but go in tandem. Can I bring you on to your other passions? I know you have many passions, and I'm trying to, in an hour, it's not easy to cover them all, but Laochra Loch Lao, and I know you're passionate about fanatical, I'm told, about sport, about your sport.
That's sport.
Tell me how that came about, and the logic behind it.
Yep. Okay. Well, I mean, again, this is a really positive story, because constantly we're always talking about the campaign and you know, the challenges and everything that's involved with that, and you're constantly out, and there's almost, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but there's almost like an aggressive tone to it, or something where you're always, you know, asking and demanding and stuff like this. Whereas this is something which is, in many respects, much more pleasurable to talk about. So with Laochra Loch Lao, again, back in 2006, we had been having conversations. There were efforts. Again, this was post-Good Friday Agreement. There was a certain buzz. Suddenly, funding was being made available. Radio Falcha was established and given funding. Cultúrlann was flying. Forbridge First Year was established and stuff. So you could see the beginnings of a burgeoning Irish language civil society here in the north. And I remember many years later, and this is in his book actually, in Jake McShakey's book, but we had been down in Glór, myself and himself and Fergal McGonrachty and Shana Bratnack, and would been just having the conversation around doing something similar, and obviously inspired by our locality at the time down in Glór and the Gaeltacht there, of trying to establish or bringing something together with the combined sport and the language. So again, Joe, it's always this idea of how do we increase informal opportunities to use a language. So from a linguistic perspective, certainly Irish medium schools are the heartbeat, as I refer to, their heartbeat of the Irish language revival. But if it solely resides in schools, then the revival is going to go nowhere. And we know this because serious linguists have really analysed and studied this in depth. And what they say is, if you get somebody who's educated through Irish but who doesn't speak Irish outside of that school, then what happens is they'll speak English, they'll get kids, they'll raise their kids through English, but then they'll send them back to the Irish school, who they internally, and so you're never really getting past that cul-de-sac. You're constantly going around the corner. Whereas if you do give people the chance to learn and use the language in an informal setting, there's much more opportunity that they may well raise their kids through Irish. So we were constantly coming up, and the youth work is another element of that, which I've been involved in, ideas of trying to increase people's opportunity to use the language informally. And sport here at GAA particularly is massive. So it's a massive part of people's lives. So originally we had sought permission to enter the Gaeltacht competition, and it was about giving status to the Gaeltacht quarter here, which again, Forbridge First Year were driving as well at that time. So giving status to that. And also the social element of bringing people together to speak Irish. So it was originally established as a amalgamated club, and we drew members from Móna, Laochra, St. Galls. We even let one or two Johnnies play for us as well over the years. So we pulled that together, and that was an amalgamated team. But what was happening is, over time, as the commitments on players increased, and we've seen now we're reaching a really crazy point in terms of the commitments and the time constraints on voluntary players, which is what GA teams are, that it was becoming more and more difficult. And although we were going away, so our primary focus was one weekend a year in some unbelievable place, generally in the west of Ireland, and it was a brilliant competition, but still, in spite of it, it was actually hard to get people to go. So maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it became apparent, listen, it's time either to call this a day or to do something radically different. And the radically different thing we were talking about was actually establishing ourselves as our own standalone club. So we aren't an amalgamated team that comes together once a year. We're actually a standalone club which functions just the same as every other GA club. And what was interesting was that obviously there was a good appetite for it and there was a good thirst for it, but there was also a bit of opposition to it, because there was, and again, I understand the opposition, because people were of the opinion that, okay, but if this happens, and if we take all the Gaelgory from Móna and all the Gaelgory from Laochra and stuff, or we're not weakening the language in all these other clubs. And that was interesting, and that got us all thinking. And I remember being over, I was actually at a conference of language commissioners in Wales in May 2017, and they had a couple of breakout sessions after, and there was one on sport, because Welsh football and stuff was flying, and they were talking about how they used the Welsh language to bring people together and all this stuff. So, and they had a similar thing with rugby in the 60s, where a number of rugby teams just switched to using the Welsh language as their language. So I'd said to them about the dilemma that we were facing, and they were saying actually the opposite's true. What you will find is when you establish this club, when you start operating and functioning entirely through the Mirror Irish, you will see an increase in the amount of Irish that is used by the other clubs, and that happened almost overnight. So once, because, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but almost there was a competitive element. So once we were established, we were going, well, here, we need to make sure that we get our own house in order in terms of the language. So suddenly other clubs were putting out their posters in Irish, we're putting out posts on social media in Irish, and we're doing all this other stuff, and that was brilliant for us. We welcome that warmly. So we then set it up at underage structures, and again, we done surveys and all the bunch calls, and what we looked at was that there's still quite a bit of kids that aren't playing. So it wasn't an idea of going and poaching kids from other clubs or going and poaching members from other clubs. It was who's not involved in GAA. because we have something that you may well be interested in. And the way we were able to sell it to parents was with the language, with a decent element of the language. Not only there's a health and well-being element, the sport and socialisation, but also this will help your kids at school. So this will give them an added kick, an added advantage at school. And what's really interesting, the projects now flying will have under 12 girls and boys and boy right down to nursery provision, and then we also have a senior girls and senior boys, senior men's and women's team as well. The actually women's team are in the semi-final of their championship here this week. So what we have, if you were to arrive into any one of our training sessions from anywhere around the world, you would just imagine that everyone here speaks Irish, because Irish is the dominant acoustic, I just call it, as referred to. Irish is the language that is used by coaches, by kids, by trainers, by men, by women, by everybody around her. So it's a big undertaking organising, and which I probably really didn't understand properly at the time, but I do certainly now. It is a massive undertaking on your time, but it's definitely something that's worthwhile. And the final point I want to make on that, Joe, is that we frame that project, we frame that within the Dream Dearg Campaign, because that was actually happening in 2017. So when the Dream Dearg Campaign was at its peak, we were on. So, and that's that point that I was making earlier. It's a twin element of certainly lobbying and campaigning and asking the state for something, but also not waiting. And the Laochra Loch Lao was the example of the not waiting. If we want something, we're going to go out and do it ourselves. So we're going to go out and undertake this huge developmental task of establishing a GAA club, while at the same time demanding the state treat us like equal citizens. So again, we don't have to wait on them to do that. We can do it ourselves. And it's been hugely positive.
We have 5 minutes left. We've talked for nearly an hour, and time flies. That's in that Dream Dearg spirit, that kind of motivation, that drive that promotes, pushes, learns, does all the things. You recently became the director of Cultúrlann, which is a big undertaking, I have to say. In trepidations, were you worried about it? Was it like, sleepless nights, or did you just go for it?
To be honest, it was a bit of a wrench, because the work that I'd been involved in previously, which was tied very much in with the campaigning element of the Dream Dearg stuff, I love that job. I still do. It's something that I got a lot from, personally speaking. So it wasn't as much as such trepidation about coming to the Cultúrlann. It was more about leaving the previous job, which again had given me so much, and that I had really got something from. So, but in terms of the Cultúrlann, I was educated here. Our school was down the stairs. It's something that has given me so much through my lives. Now, I more recently, I've been taking my kids here for all the amazing family events and stuff that are organised here. So this, in many respects, is the heartbeat of our community. And I have gotten so much from the Cultúrlann over the years. As I say, my education, I would have been here almost daily anyway, lunch or calling in for coffee or calling in for meetings or whatever. So when the opportunity come up to get involved in that project and to contribute something and give something back, it was something that I couldn't resist. It was something that I said, well, this is somewhere that I might as well get paid for it. I'm there every day anyway. I might as well get paid for being there. So, and see what I can do. And it's something completely different. And I'm a person who believes in kind of challenging yourself as well, and sometimes taking yourself out of your comfort zone, because life's too short, and you don't have regrets, and you want to see where your strengths and where your weaknesses are, and where do you need to improve and stuff. So with the Cultúrlann, that's certainly, it was in that vein that I come on. It was just around, listen, this is an amazing project. This is something that's given me so much. Now it's time maybe I can give something back to it, and do it as a job as well, which is incredibly fortunate.
Very last question. And I always keep the last questions to the last, because they're the ones I trip you up on. They're the ones,
We'll need our hour here, Joe.
When you reassure somebody, no, there's no difficult questions. It's all right. How do you see us all progressing in the immediate future, in terms of the language, in terms of culture, in terms of reaching out, involving others, in terms of, just kind of solidifying the work that began for you all those years ago on the Shaw's Road? So where do you see our future? What direction do you see our future taking?
Well, in the current climate, Joe, that is an incredibly difficult question to answer, but also an incredibly important question, because we are, I think, globally speaking, we are at a really, really dire situation here. We really are at a crossroads here. I mean, we obviously have the pandemic, which has exposed a lot of the underlying fault lines that existed previous to that. We have a planet that's on the verge of dying. We have huge inequalities right across the world, and we have the rising tide of fascism again on our streets. We saw protests in Dublin there by fascists during the week. We're seeing this across the world. So I think, you know, for what it's worth, that anyone who wants to see a safe and prosperous future for the world and for people who live here, that we need to start organising, that we need to start doing the lessons of Ciarán Dearg are almost at the point here. The October meeting that I mentioned in 2016, where we know what the problems are, but we need to start getting our heads together around solutions. Because I think, and again, vesting our interest or subcontracting our political activism out to political parties just isn't going to cut it anymore. I think what we need to do and what we all need to reflect on is that we get the change that we deserve. You know, power never cedes change without a demand, and we need to be that demand. We can see the problems, we know what they are. The Irish language is related to all this. I mean, the Irish language is a victim of colonialism and more recently of neoliberalism, which in turn is destroying the planet, which in turn is leading to huge inequality. So all these issues aren't in isolation from each other. They're all very much related. So the solution in terms of an equitable future for the Irish language also ties in with the solution around an equitable future for the planet. And in my view, that we need to address the key imbalances in the type of society that we've built here. The idea that, you know, that it's acceptable that just working class kids, you know, don't attain as well in schools, that, you know, the suicide rates in North Belfast are so high, that, you know, that the planet, as I say, there's huge wildfires raising, that is somehow acceptable and tolerable is just crazy. And we need to stop, you know, accepting those things and start offering an alternative, because the alternatives are all there. People are having these very same conversations right now around the world. You know, we had some of them brought to us by the fella this year, which was amazing. People like Noam Chomsky and stuff offering us hope for the future. But I think the time for us now to become actual active citizens and trying to become the change they want to see is right now. We can no longer wait.
That's the ethos of Scéalta, and in fact, that's why we have you as our guest tonight, and it's to generate that discussion and to look forward. Scéalta came about as a byproduct of the lockdown, and it has progressed. I hope it has progressed since then. So, thank you for being my guest. It's been a very quick 1 hour. We've covered a whole lot of material and stuff that's absolutely vital to you and vital to me and of importance to everyone. So from Scéalta, Ciarán, Garamila, thank you.
Joe, it's been a pleasure to be with you here for the hour. Thank you very much.
Amor.
Amor.